Have you ever paused to wonder about the philosophical figures whose names don't really echo through the halls of our classrooms?
Mm.
The ones who, for various reasons, seem to have been lost to the sands of time or, I don't know, perhaps even deliberately obscured from our collective memory.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question.
Imagine, at the very dawn of Western philosophy, right? When the fundamental questions were first being posed and the bedrock of thought was being laid, were there significant voices that simply didn't make it into the history books we read today?
Or maybe voices that did make it but were sort of misunderstood, or their ideas got repackaged.
Exactly. Or repackaged under different names.
That's a profound question, definitely. And for anyone who loves, digging into the history of ideas, confronting these kinds of obscured figures isn't just academic archaeology. It's really an essential exercise in understanding how knowledge itself gets constructed, how it's transmitted, and, yeah, sometimes suppressed. It pushes us, doesn't it, to critically examine the very narratives we've inherited, urging us to look, beyond the surface.
Absolutely. And today, on AI History of Western Philosophy, we're taking a deep dive into precisely such a figure, Theano of Croton.
Ah, Theano.
Yes, she's supposedly a major player, a philosopher who flourished way back in the 6th century BCE, right at the inception of Western thought. And she's firmly, inextricably linked with the groundbreaking Pythagorean school.
That's right.
Her story, as we'll hopefully uncover, isn't just about the life of one person. It's this fascinating, really complex tale about how history itself gets written, and maybe how it gets unwritten.
Her name, Theano, it definitely reverberates through the centuries, doesn't it? But her actual historical presence, it's almost ghostly.
Ghostly, yeah, that's a good word.
She stands as this potent symbol of the incredible complexities involved in truly piecing together the philosophical past, particularly when it comes to voices that didn't fit neatly into, the later established narratives.
Okay, so let's call this what it is. The Theano problem. For us, as learners and, curious minds, trying to understand Theano is less like solving some straightforward historical puzzle.
Right.
And more like trying to put together an ancient jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half might be from a completely different box entirely.
That's a great analogy.
It's a very specific, really intriguing manifestation of a broader challenge in historiography, something scholars sometimes refer to as the diotema problem.
Right, the diotema problem, that general difficulty.
Exactly. That persistent difficulty of verifying the historical reality and the actual tangible contributions of ancient women philosophers. And it's primarily because there's such a severe scarcity of genuinely contemporary evidence.
Almost none, usually.
Right. And then you've got this surplus of later accounts that often conflict with each other, or sometimes are even just fabricated.
That's it, exactly. The Theano problem isn't just some minor inconvenience like, oh, we don't have her exact birth date. No, it's a fundamental tension. It forces us to grapple with these contradictory perspectives.
Okay, so what are the two sides here?
Well, on one side, you have the popular accounts, right? The ones perpetuated through various channels, often portraying her as this historical certainty. Pythagoras' brilliant wife, maybe a profound mathematician, even the leader of the school after he died.
The sort of romantic, inspiring version?
Kind of, yeah. But then on the other side, you have modern classical scholarship. And through really rigorous analysis, it's arrived at an almost unequivocal consensus that practically all the works explicitly attributed to her are spurious. They're pseudepigrapha, meaning they were composed centuries after she supposedly lived. Other authors simply put her revered name on their work to give it more authority.
Wow. Okay. So that's a huge gap. We're caught in this fascinating intellectual bind, then, between this inspiring narrative of a foundational female philosopher and the cold, hard, dispassionate facts, or rather, the consensus of scholarship.
Exactly.
It means our mission today, here on AI History of Western Philosophy, isn't simply to ask, was Theano real? Because, that question might not even have a simple yes or no answer.
It probably doesn't.
Instead, we're going to ask, what does the story of Theano, in all its complexity, reveal about the history of philosophy itself? And maybe even more critically, about how we go about writing that history.
Precisely. The significant historical vacuum around her actual life has, in this kind of strange twist, transformed Theano into a sort of blank canvas.
A blank canvas.
Yeah. upon which subsequent eras have projected their own ideals, their own intellectual agendas, their own evolving ideas about the role of women in the pursuit of wisdom. So, our inquiry today is fundamentally about understanding Theano's enduring significance, not as an unverifiable historical reality necessarily,
Right.
but rather as this powerful, illuminating philosophical construct.
And for you, our listener, as a learner on this journey with us,
Yeah.
this approach, we think, is actually far more illuminating than just trying to definitively find her. Because it forces us to confront these fundamental, unavoidable questions about, well, the nature of our historical sources, the pervasive influence of bias in historical narratives, and really the very nature of historical knowledge itself. It's like a masterclass in critical thinking, just looking at this one figure.
Absolutely. And the central difficulty, as we've hinted, it lies in this complete absence of authentic writings from her supposed lifetime back in the 6th century BCE. Just nothing survives.
Nothing contemporary at all.
Nope. And the biographical accounts that do mention her, which we'll definitely get into, they only emerge centuries later, like anywhere from 800 to 1500 years later.
This is staggering.
It is. And these accounts aren't just sparse, they are often wildly conflicting. So our discussion today is firmly grounded in, critical research that thoroughly examines these challenges. It highlights the stark dichotomy between the popular perception and the academic consensus about these ancient texts. It really is a case study in intellectual detective work.
Okay, so with that fascinating problem laid out, let's try and set the stage a bit. To even begin to understand Theano, whether we see her as a real person or mainly as this later construct, we first have to immerse ourselves in the world she supposedly inhabited.
Mm-hmm.
And let me tell you, this is where it gets truly fascinating. We're talking about Magna Graecia in the Archaic period, specifically the 6th century BCE, southern Italy. What was this place actually like?
Right, Magna Graecia, Great Greece, as the Greeks called it. It was far from some quiet, isolated backwater. From maybe the 8th century BCE onwards, you had these waves of ambitious Greek colonists
Right.
venturing across the Adriatic, setting up dozens of vibrant, flourishing city-states along the southern coast of Italy. Think Tarentum, Sybaris, and the one we're focused on today, Croton.
And these weren't just small outposts.
Oh, not at all. They weren't just sleepy settlements. They were dynamic, highly competitive, often pretty volatile extensions of the Greek world. They didn't just survive, they absolutely thrived. They quickly blossomed into these powerful centers of commerce, rich agriculture, distinct culture. In many ways, by the 6th century, some of them actually eclipsed their mother cities back on mainland Greece in terms of just sheer wealth and political clout.
So it wasn't just a few scattered towns. It was this flourishing, almost aggressive, competitive landscape, like a new frontier maybe, bursting with energy and opportunity.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. By the 6th century BCE, this region was characterized by intense economic competition and, frequent, often brutal warfare between these prosperous cities.
Wow.
They were constantly vying to expand their territories, control the lucrative trade routes, assert their dominance. And this unique environment, a true frontier society, like you said, less bound by the really entrenched, often rigid traditions of older centers like Athens or Sparta,
Yeah.
it proved to be exceptionally fertile ground
Subtle ground.
for an unparalleled spirit of intellectual and religious experimentation, sort of a philosophical free-for-all. New ideas, radical cults, innovative ways of life could take root and spread rapidly here in a way they maybe couldn't have elsewhere.
So it's a real melting pot then, a place ripe for genuinely revolutionary ideas to emerge and flourish.
Precisely. This vibrant cultural ferment attracted this extraordinary array of thinkers, mystics, religious figures from all across the Greek world. They found in Magna Graecia this uniquely receptive audience for novel philosophical and spiritual movements, an openness to new ways of thinking about the cosmos, about society, about the individual soul.
Which is where Pythagoras comes in.
Exactly. The arrival of Pythagoras of Samos in Croton around 530 BCE wasn't some isolated incident. It was perfectly aligned with this broader pattern of intellectual migration. He brought with him the synthesis of mathematical rigor, mystical insights, ethical principles that, would have been radical anywhere, but found an almost perfect opportunity to truly flourish in the dynamic society of Croton. The very existence of the Pythagorean school, and by extension the historical possibility of a figure like Theano, is absolutely inseparable from these specific socio-political conditions of 6th century BCE Magna Graecia. This truly was the crucible where radical new ideas could not just survive, but actively thrive.
Fascinating. So what kind of ideas are we talking about, and what was this Pythagorean community actually like? You mentioned it was more than just a school. It was a countercultural experiment. Can you paint a picture for us?
Indeed. The
Yeah.
community Pythagoras founded in Croton was radically different from anything we might imagine as, say, an academic institution today. It was, at its core, a comprehensive way of life, a bios, designed to foster spiritual purification and intellectual enlightenment.
A whole way of life.
Yeah. Imagine a secretive, almost monastic brotherhood infused with this quasi-religious devotion. It aimed for the holistic purification of the soul, not just through study, but through this unique blend of intellectual discipline, strict ascetic practice, and even, at times, direct political engagement. Members committed to it entirely.
And how was this intensive community structured? Was it open to just anyone who was curious?
Not at all. It had a remarkably clear, almost rigid hierarchical organization. You had an inner circle of fully initiated members, known as the mathematicoi.
The learners.
Literally, the learners, yeah.
Yeah.
These were the true intellectual elite, privy to the deepest, most esoteric teachings of the master himself. They engaged intensely, almost ritually, in studying pure mathematics, the complex harmonies of music, the intricate movements of astronomy.
But not just as subjects.
No, viewing these disciplines as the fundamental path to understanding the cosmic order, the very blueprint of reality.
Mm.
Then you had a larger outer circle, the acousmatikoi,
Listen.
the listeners. These followers adhered faithfully to the ethical precepts and ritual prohibitions of the school, but without necessarily being initiated into the deeper philosophical justifications or the more abstract intellectual foundations that the mathematicoi pursued. They lived by the rules, but didn't necessarily know why all the rules existed.
So it was about living a certain way, guided by specific principles. What were some of those core ideas that really defined their unique worldview?
Central to the Pythagorean worldview were several profound and interconnected doctrines. One was metempsychosis.
Transmigration of souls.
Yeah, the belief that souls are immortal and migrate from one body to another, human or animal, after death. Flowing directly from this was the concept of the profound kinship of all living beings.
Oh, which explains the vegetarianism.
It underpinned many of their famous dietary restrictions, notably vegetarianism, yes. And perhaps most famously, they held this revolutionary belief that reality at its most fundamental level is mathematical in nature.
Right, numbers is the key.
Numbers weren't just tools for counting or calculation. They were the very essence, the underlying structure, the harmonious principle of existence itself. The universe was like a grand mathematical symphony.
It sounds incredibly intense, deeply immersive, and just.
Hmm.
All-encompassing. Did they literally live together, share everything?
Yeah, for the inner circle, it was largely a communal lifestyle. They often shared property, lived in close proximity, adhered to quite strict dietary rules, abstaining from certain foods thought to disturb the soul's purity, like beans, for instance.
Right, the infamous bean prohibition.
Exactly. And there was a strong emphasis on disciplined silence, deep introspection, rigorous self-examination, and absolute loyalty to the brotherhood and its shared ideals. It was an intentional community, meticulously designed to foster a very specific way of living, thinking, and ultimately sort of ascending towards a higher state of being.
But here's the truly radical part, especially when we consider the general norms of the ancient world, and what makes the very idea of Theano even historically plausible in this context. The Pythagorean community's inclusion of women. It stood in stark, almost revolutionary contrast to prevailing Greek norms. Can you give us a clearer picture of the typical situation for women in, say, 6th century BCE Athens, just to highlight that contrast?
Sure. In 6th century BCE Athens, for example, women were legally perpetual minors. They couldn't own property, couldn't conduct legal business independently, certainly couldn't participate in public or political life. Their existence was largely confined to the domestic sphere, the oikos, the household, and always under the authority of a male guardian, a kyrios.
Father, brother, husband.
Exactly. And education beyond basic household management and maybe some music or poetry was generally not extended to women, certainly not philosophical or scientific training. So for the Pythagorean school in Croton to actively include women and for them to be recognized as part of its philosophical and spiritual life, that truly represented a profound, almost defiant countercultural experiment. It was a real anomaly in the landscape of ancient Greek society.
And are there specific credible ancient sources that actually confirm this surprising inclusivity? This isn't just an assumption we're making, right?
Absolutely not. Ancient sources, most notably the Neoplatonist biographer Porphyry, writing centuries later, yes, but drawing on earlier traditions, explicitly states that when Pythagoras first arrived in Croton, he delivered distinct speeches to different segments of the population.
Okay.
And crucially, this included a specific direct address to the city's women. This isn't just a passing comment. It indicates that women's engagement and their recognized place within his new community were significant enough to warrant a dedicated address from the master himself.
So that inclusion, the fact that the Pythagorean school genuinely welcomed female participation, that's key.
It's not just a curious footnote. It is, in fact, the essential precondition for the entire later tradition surrounding Theano and other Pythagorean women. Without this foundational historical reality that women were involved in this particular school, the later stories and attributed texts about them simply wouldn't have been plausible to anyone.
Right. So the fact that women were actively involved in this specific philosophical school, unlike almost all others, made it believable later on that there could be genuine female Pythagorean philosophers.
Precisely.
And that belief, even if it got exaggerated later, created the space for these texts attributed to figures like Theano.
Exactly. The historical plausibility of female philosophers existing within the Pythagorean school, a feature that genuinely distinguished it from pretty much all other major philosophical movements of antiquity, is what made it such fertile ground for the subsequent literary production of texts under female names. Centuries later, when Neo-Pythagorean authors wanted to create this venerable female philosophical lineage to authorize their teachings on, say, domestic ethics or cosmology, they didn't just invent a female Stoic or peripatetic philosopher.
Because no one would have believed it.
Exactly. Such a figure would have lacked all credibility. Instead, they strategically turned to the one school where the historical existence of women philosophers was a known and accepted part of its enduring tradition. The actual countercultural social structure of the 6th century BCE community in Croton thus provided the necessary verisimilitude.
The appearance of truth.
Yeah, the appearance of being true or real for the later, often fictional, construction of Theano as an author and a sage. The historical reality of female participation directly enabled the subsequent creation of a pseudepigraphical female legacy. It's this fascinating interplay between fact and later fiction.
Okay, so if the community genuinely allowed women philosophers, and it was plausible that figures like Theano could exist, why then is she herself so frustratingly elusive? Why can't we just point to a solid biography and say, here she is, this is her life story?
That's the absolute crux of the Theano problem, isn't it? And why it remains such a powerful challenge for historians? Despite the historical plausibility of her existence within this uniquely inclusive Pythagorean school, any attempt to construct a definitive, verifiable biography of Theano just collapses pretty quickly under the weight of the profoundly contradictory ancient sources.
The sources we do have.
The primary testimonia, those ancient references and accounts that mention her by name, are found in the works of Diogenes Laertius, the Neoplatonists Porphyry and Iamblichus, and that vast Byzantine encyclopedia known as the Suda.
Right.
The crucial point, again, is that all of these sources were written between 800 and 1500 years after she supposedly lived.
That's just an enormous time gap. It's like trying to write a definitive biography of someone from the European Middle Ages based solely on accounts written by historians living today or even in the 20th century. What does that mean for their reliability as factual historical records?
It means their reliability for hard biographical facts is extremely low. And crucially, these sources are not disinterested historical records in the modern sense. The biographies of Pythagoras by Porphyry and Iamblichus in particular are what we categorize as Neoplatonic hagiographies.
Hagiographies, lives of saints, essentially.
Pretty much. They weren't aiming for journalistic accuracy. Instead, they were crafted with a very clear, often religious, philosophical agenda. Their primary purpose was to present Pythagoras not as a mere historical figure, but as a divine sage, a godlike soul sent to enlighten humanity, the ultimate, almost mystical wellspring of a philosophical tradition that they believed flowed directly through Plato and culminated in their own complex Neoplatonic system.
So they had an agenda.
A big one. They include figures like Theano not for precise historical accuracy about her individual life, but rather to complete an idealized portrait of Pythagoras as the founder of a comprehensive way of life that encompassed both the public and private spheres. So, having a wise wife and philosophical daughters who were custodians of his wisdom, that fit perfectly into this divine narrative.
So, she's included to fill out Pythagoras' mythic story, to make him seem more complete as a founder, rather than to give us objective factual information about her life.
Exactly. And when these late sources are examined critically, the biographical details they provide for Theano just dissolve into this web of frustrating inconsistencies. There is simply no agreement among them on her most basic biographical data, her precise relationship to Pythagoras, her parentage, or even her place of origin.
It's not just minor differences.
No, it's less like historical records and more like a game of ancient telephone where every retelling changed fundamental facts about her life. For example, Porphyry calls her the Cretan daughter of Pythonax and definitively the wife of Pythagoras. Iamblichus, citing the much earlier Aristoxenus, who is closer in time but still centuries removed, identifies her as the wife of another Pythagorean, Brontinus, from Metapontum.
Completely different husband and origin.
And then Diogenes Laertius, drawing on yet a different tradition, claims she was from Croton, the daughter of Brontinus, and also the wife of Pythagoras.
So Brontinus is either her father or her husband, depending on who you read.
Yeah.
And she's from Crete, Metapontum, or Croton.
It's a complete jumble.
Yeah, it's a lot of conflicting information. She's either his wife or someone else's wife from different places. Her father's name changes. It sounds like trying to nail down a single historical person from these accounts is genuinely impossible.
It is. This fundamental disagreement among the most authoritative ancient sources, and these are the only sources we have, renders any attempt to write a traditional, verifiable biography of Theano futile. The contradictions aren't minor discrepancies we can somehow smooth over. They are mutually exclusive accounts of her core identity and relationships.
So the scholarly consensus is,
The modern scholarly consensus, therefore, is firm. A historically verifiable Theano, a distinct individual whose life can be confidently reconstructed, is simply beyond our reach. We just don't have the reliable evidence.
so what does this all mean for us as we explore the history of Western philosophy?
Right.
It means we can't write a traditional biography. The real value of these early accounts isn't in their facts about her life, but in what they reveal about the construction of a philosophical legend. Theano exists most tangibly, most powerfully, as a name to which various traditions, ideals, identities were attached over centuries. This is precisely why we call it the Theano Problem, because it forces us to confront the very nature of historical inquiry when our sources are so fraught, so contradictory, and so imbued with later agendas. It teaches us to be skeptical, but also maybe to look for deeper meaning in the stories themselves. Okay, so while the historical Theano herself remains frustratingly shrouded in this fog of contradictory ancient accounts, there are philosophical works that have been attributed to her. This feels like a potential breakthrough.
Yeah.
So we do have her actual philosophy right. That should clear things up, or at least give us a window into her mind.
Well, this is where the story gets even more fascinating and perhaps a bit more complicated again. While ancient sources like the Suda, that vast Byzantine encyclopedia we mentioned, do indeed attribute various works to Theano, like Pythagorean apophthegms or advice to women, none of those longer, more comprehensive treatises have actually survived to the present day. What does remain for us to examine are two specific, smaller pieces of writing. A fragment from a work titled On Piety, and a collection of 7 short ethical letters. These are the texts we actually have to work with when we talk about Theano's philosophy.
Okay, a fragment and 7 letters. And what's the scholarly verdict on these specific surviving works? Are they genuinely from the 6th century BCE, from Theano herself?
The unanimous and long-standing consensus of modern classical scholarship is definitive on this. This entire corpus, both the fragment and the letters, is entirely spurious.
Entirely. Why?
Yeah. This isn't a minor point of academic disagreement. It's a definitive conclusion drawn from rigorous philological, the study of language and historical sources and historical analysis. Scholars have definitively placed the composition of these texts much, much later. Specifically in the Hellenistic or early Roman Imperial periods, likely somewhere between the 1st century BCE and the 2nd century CE.
So anywhere from 4 to 7 centuries after Theano supposedly lived.
That's right. Centuries later.
Okay. What's the compelling evidence for such a strong, unanimous claim? How do scholars know these aren't authentic works from her time?
The evidence is indeed compelling, and it comes from several angles. Firstly, there's the language itself. The texts often feature this inconsistent and somewhat artificial Doric dialect.
Artificial.
Yeah, while Doric was a genuine ancient Greek dialect, the way it's used here is almost like someone trying too hard to sound ancient or authentic rather than naturally speaking it. This was actually a common stylistic trait of Neo-Pythagorean forgeries from that later period, deliberately attempting to evoke a sense of archaic antiquity and authority. It's like a modern writer trying to compose a philosophical text in Elizabethan English just to make it sound venerable.
So they're trying too hard to sound old. That's a good clue.
Exactly. But even more decisively, the texts contain clear and undeniable historical anachronisms.
Like what?
For instance, one of the letters explicitly attributed to Theano mentions Plato's dialogue Parmenides. Big problem. Plato wrote the Parmenides nearly 2 centuries after Theano's supposed lifetime. It's an impossible situation for her to have authored it.
Okay, that's an open and shut case right there. If she's referencing a work that didn't exist when she lived, it literally could not have been her words.
Precisely. It's like finding a letter attributed to, I don't know, Julius Caesar discussing Shakespeare. It just doesn't work.
Right.
Furthermore, the philosophical concerns, the specific arguments, the technical terminology used within the texts themselves, they all point strongly to a post-Platonic and post-Aristotelian intellectual environment. They engage with concepts and debates that simply hadn't developed yet in the archaic Greece of the 6th century BCE.
So the ideas themselves are too modern for her time.
Exactly. These works, therefore, must be understood as pseudepigraphical texts written by later authors who, for various reasons, adopted the name of a revered early figure like Theano to lend authority, prestige, or maybe a sense of historical continuity to their own compositions.
So while they don't tell us about the historical Theano, they are absolutely fascinating for what they tell us about later Pythagorean thought, about how philosophical traditions evolve, and about the strategic use of historical figures to legitimize new ideas.
Absolutely. They're valuable sources, just not for what they initially seem to be.
Okay, so even though they're not her words, they're still incredibly valuable for understanding the intellectual landscape of later periods. Let's dive into the actual philosophy found in these attributed works then. Starting with this intriguing metaphysical fragment from On Piety. What profound idea does it articulate?
Right. The single pivotal fragment with metaphysical content comes from her purported work On Piety. In it, the author offers this crucial clarification of the central Pythagorean doctrine concerning the relationship between number and reality. It states, and I'll paraphrase slightly for clarity, I have learned that many of the Greeks supposed Pythagoras said that everything came to be from number.
Okay, from number.
But he did not say that things came to be from number, but according to number, katarrhythmon. And then the author raises this very pointed critical question about that from number interpretation, how something that does not even exist is thought to beget things.
That sounds like a subtle distinction, but maybe a profoundly important one. From number versus according to number. Can you unpack that for us? What's the real philosophical weight behind that shift?
This passage represents a remarkably sophisticated philosophical maneuver. It's clearly designed to defend Pythagoreanism from a common and quite potent criticism of its core tenets. The distinction it draws is absolutely fundamental.
Right.
When we talk about generation from number, exarithma, this implies that numbers are the literal material substrate or the efficient cause of the cosmos. It suggests a kind of numerical atomism.
Like things are made of numbers.
Yeah, where physical objects are literally composed of numerical units, as if you could construct a table or a mountain out of 2s and 3s. This view, whether it was accurately attributed to the earliest Pythagoreans or not, is philosophically vulnerable.
How so?
Well, as the author of the fragment astutely points out, it raises the seemingly insurmountable problem of how an abstract, non-existent entity like a number can literally generate a concrete existing object. It opens the entire doctrine to ridicule as a fundamental category error.
Right. It's like saying the blueprint for a house is the house, or literally builds the house itself.
Exactly. It makes no logical sense. It's like saying a recipe is the cake.
Okay, so from number sounds a bit simplistic, maybe even easily attacked. What about according to number, katarrhythmon? How does that reframe things, and why is that so much more powerful conceptually?
This revised formulation reframes the role of number entirely. It elevates it from a material cause to a formal or paradigmatic principle.
A principle, not a substance.
Right. In this more sophisticated view, the cosmos is not made of numbers, but its structure, its underlying order, its fundamental intelligibility are determined by numerical relationships, ratios, harmonies. Number provides the primary ordering taxes, the rational, elegant framework that makes reality a cosmos, an ordered, beautiful whole, rather than pure chaos.
So things exist according to number.
Because they are arranged sequentially, proportionally, harmoniously, reflecting the inherent order found in the number series itself, it's about the patterns, the principles, the blueprint that define existence, not the literal building blocks.
Like music.
That's a perfect analogy. Think of a beautiful piece of music. It's not made of numbers, but its beauty, its harmony, its very existence is structured according to mathematical ratios and relationships.
And what's truly profound here is that this isn't just ancient hair-splitting, is it? This subtle but profound shift reflects the philosophical concerns of a later, more developed intellectual landscape.
Almost certainly the Hellenistic period, yeah.
It's like an attempt to correct the record of early Pythagoreanism, aligning it with a much more sophisticated metaphysical framework, almost anticipating Plato's theory of forms, maybe, where ideal structures underpin messy reality.
Precisely. As the classical scholar Walter Burkert, among others, has compellingly argued, this specific distinction is characteristic of the Hellenistic period. This was a time when philosophical schools engaged in rigorous, nuanced debate, constantly seeking to refine and defend their foundational doctrines in the wake of the powerful systems developed by Plato and Aristotle.
So it's a defense strategy almost.
The fragment from On Piety can thus be seen as a strategic move by a later Pythagorean thinker to correct the record, defending the revered master's teaching from a crude, easily ridiculed interpretation, and instead aligning it with a more robust, sophisticated metaphysical framework.
And that bit about number not even existing.
Yeah, that statement, that number does not even exist, is particularly telling. It explicitly distances this brand of Pythagoreanism from later Neoplatonic views, which would eventually grant numbers a higher, ideal, even divine existence. So it's not just a defense, it's a mark of the ongoing evolution and refinement of philosophical ideas over centuries, all while carefully attributed to an ancient sage like Theano to give it weight.
Fascinating stuff.
Right.
Beyond these grand metaphysical ideas, Theano is also attributed with this collection of ethical letters, which apply Pythagorean thought to the very practical domestic sphere. These aren't personal letters in the modern sense, are they? More like philosophical instruction manuals dressed up as letters.
Exactly. These letters, addressed to other women like Eubial, Callisto, and Nicostrate, they aren't personal correspondence like we think of it today, casual chats between friends or family. Instead, they are short, concise, ethical treatises that strategically use the epistolary form, the letter format, as a vehicle to deliver philosophical advice on the proper conduct of a woman's life within her household and family.
And you said there were three main themes.
Their content can be organized around three central recurring themes, yeah. Each systematically applying core Pythagorean ethical principles to specific domestic situations.
Okay, what's the first of these vital themes?
The first is child rearing, exemplified beautifully in the letter to Eubule. This letter advocates for a surprisingly austere, almost anti-hedonistic approach to raising children.
Austere? How so?
The author explicitly criticizes mothers who excessively indulge their children's desires for pleasure, arguing that such pampering corrupts their natural character and fundamentally prevents the development of true virtue.
Interesting.
A very sharp distinction is drawn between a loving mother who is genuinely concerned with her child's moral character and long-term well-being, and a doting one who's concerned only with their immediate satisfaction and fleeting happiness.
So tough love, essentially.
Kind of. The letter contends that true virtue, like a muscle, is perfected through hardship, discipline, a certain degree of self-denial, not through luxury or constant gratification. So, yeah, no spoiling the kids, even in ancient philosophy. It really shows that some debates about parenting are pretty timeless.
That's definitely a stark contrast to some modern parenting philosophies. Okay, what's the second theme these letters tackle?
The second theme is household management, found prominently in the letter to Callisto. This letter extends the Pythagorean philosophy of moderation, or due measure, to an often overlooked area, the treatment of servants, specifically slaves.
Oh, that's interesting. What does it say?
The letter's core claim is groundbreaking and remarkably progressive for its time. It asserts that slaves, despite their legal status, are human in nature and therefore must be treated with justice and dignity.
Wow. That is progressive for the ancient world.
It really is. The author specifically cautions against both excessive leniency, which could lead to insolence, and excessive harshness, arguing that both extremes reveal a profound flaw in the character of the mistress. The ultimate goal, the letter argues, is to cultivate goodwill and loyalty among servants through just treatment, emphasizing the use of reason and calm guidance rather than righteous indignation or brute force as a means of control. This ethical stance on a prevalent social institution is truly advanced.
That's incredibly powerful, emphasizing the shared humanity of slaves when that was certainly not a universal belief. And the third theme.
The third theme, marital harmony, is explored in several letters, most notably the letter to Nicostrate. This letter offers very practical and insightful advice to a wife whose husband has been unfaithful, a common and devastating issue in ancient society.
What's the advice? Not what you might expect.
Instead of reacting with overwhelming jealousy, anger, or public recrimination, which the text argues would only compound the disorder within the family and undermine her own dignity, the wife is counseled to act with sophrosyne.
Sophrosyne, the key Greek concept.
Exactly, embodying moderation, prudence, self-control, a sense of inner balance. The argument here is both ethical and strategic.
How so strategic?
By maintaining her own virtue, decorum, and composure, she distinguishes herself sharply from the courtesan or the object of her husband's fleeting affection. In doing so, she creates the best possible conditions for her husband's eventual repentance and ultimately a return to the harmonious order of the family. It's about maintaining your own moral compass and the integrity of the family unit rather than immediate destructive retribution.
So it's about maintaining your own moral core, not about immediate revenge, and doing so actually transforms the situation, or at least creates the possibility for positive change. What's the unifying philosophical principle that seems to undergird all of this practical advice across the various ethical themes?
The overarching, unifying philosophical principle that undergirds all this practical advice from child rearing to managing servants to marital fidelity is that quintessential Greek and profoundly Pythagorean ideal of metron.
Do measure in all things.
Exactly. Do measure in all things. This is stated quite explicitly at the very end of the letter to Callisto, which beautifully uses the Pythagorean analogy of a well-tuned musical instrument to describe virtue. Just as strings must be neither too slack nor too taut to produce harmony, so too must one's conduct avoid all extremes.
Right.
By systematically applying this principle of appropriate balance and harmony to every conceivable aspect of domestic life, these letters perform a truly crucial philosophical function. They deliberately constitute the oikos, the household, not as a mere private, subordinate space, but as a legitimate and highly significant, indeed gendered, domain for rigorous philosophical practice.
Okay, now this feels like a truly significant philosophical intervention, especially one that challenges mainstream ancient thought. Because in the dominant Greek philosophies, Plato, Aristotle, the public city-state, that was considered the primary arena for ethics, for political virtue, for the full realization of human excellence.
Absolutely.
The oikos, the household, was often viewed as private, preparatory, generally subordinate, the realm of necessity rather than virtue. But these Theano letters seem to subvert, or at least significantly challenge, that traditional hierarchy.
Precisely. By taking the quintessential everyday activities of the household, raising children, managing servants, navigating complex marital relationships, and systematically analyzing them through the lens of core philosophical concepts like virtue, justice, hedonism, and measure, the letters implicitly, yet powerfully, argue that a woman can achieve profound philosophical virtue and live a truly philosophical life within her socially prescribed roles as wife and mother.
So she doesn't need to abandon the domestic sphere or try to enter the male-dominated public sphere to become a philosopher.
That's the argument. Rather, she can transform that very sphere into a rich, vital site of applied philosophy, where abstract principles are made concrete and effective.
So she doesn't need to leave home to be a philosopher. She transforms her home into a site of applied philosophy. This constructs an ideal of the Pythagorean woman as a kind of perfect counterpart to the male philosopher-statesman. He brings harmony and order to the city, the polis.
Right.
While she brings that same harmony and order, guided by wisdom, to the family, the oikos. It's almost like a philosophical division of labor that dramatically elevates the domestic.
Exactly. It's a highly strategic philosophical intervention aimed at creating a distinct, valued, and intellectually rigorous space for female intellectual and ethical agency. It argues that the principles of harmony, measure, justice are universal. They can and should be applied to all aspects of life, from the grand cosmic order, which the Pythagoreans believed was governed by numerical ratios, right down to the intricate dynamics of the family.
Making philosophy accessible and vital within the household.
Yes. It makes philosophical practice not just accessible to women, but vital and central to the functioning of a harmonious society, even within the confines of the household. It provides this powerful aspirational model for how women could participate meaningfully in the philosophical life, not by rejecting their socially defined roles, but by transforming them into a profound site of ethical and intellectual practice.
The legacy of Theano, then, it seems clearly twofold. On one hand, we have this complex, constructed archetype of the ideal female sage.
Hmm.
On the other, the rediscovery and rigorous examination of her attributed texts in the modern era has sparked this intense scholarly debate, really pushing the boundaries of historical inquiry itself. Let's talk about Theano as this philosophical archetype first. How was she envisioned, and what role did this constructed persona play?
Right. The Theano who emerges from the pseudepigraphical corpus, as we've established, is not a verifiable historical person in the biographical sense. Instead, she is a carefully constructed archetype,
Yeah.
the embodiment of the ideal female sage. Her persona is consistently presented as wise, temperate, and a master of that quintessential Pythagorean principle of harmony, which she applies with profound wisdom and practical skill to what was then considered the quintessentially female domain, the household.
And her connection to Pythagoras.
As the wife or primary student of Pythagoras, remember the specific relationship shifts in the sources, as we noted. She is strategically positioned as a direct, authoritative inheritor and a faithful interpreter of the master's deepest wisdom.
So her constructed persona serves a very clear philosophical and even legitimizing purpose for these later writers. It's not just random.
Precisely. This ideal persona served to authorize a very specific application of Pythagorean philosophy to the lives and conduct of women. It effectively legitimized what we can now recognize as a philosophy of the household. She provided this venerable, almost sacred model for female virtue, proving that profound wisdom was not exclusively a male pursuit. This wasn't just a random act of attributing texts, it was about solidifying and propagating a particular philosophical tradition, giving it a powerful ancient female voice.
And what crucial narrative role did this constructed figure of Theano play in the broader Pythagorean legacy, particularly after Pythagoras himself?
Within the broader, evolving Pythagorean tradition, this constructed figure of Theano, along with her supposed daughters like Deimo and Maia, played a truly crucial narrative role. Later accounts, often steeped in myth, credit them with the painstaking preservation of Pythagoras' secret writings and the continuation of the school itself after its violent suppression and the dispersion of its male members in Croton.
So the women carried on the tradition.
That's the story. While these stories are almost certainly legendary, their very existence is profoundly significant. They reveal this powerful strain within the Pythagorean tradition that not only included women as active participants, but also imagined a female lineage as absolutely essential for the meticulous transmission and preservation of the school's most sacred doctrines, the very heart of its wisdom. This narrative of female custodianship, this idea of women guarding and passing on the deepest secrets, solidified the school's unique identity and provided a compelling precedent for the intellectual authority of women within the Pythagorean sphere, a sphere where women could truly be the keepers of the flame.
These stories, even if legendary, are truly powerful.
Yeah.
They don't just include women. They imagine a female lineage as essential for transmitting the school's most sacred doctrines. It's such a profound counter-narrative to so many historical philosophical traditions that simply erase or ignore women.
It is, and it's why her figure remains so compelling. For centuries, these texts were just accepted at face value, weren't they? It was kind of taken for granted that these were the actual words of Theano.
Right.
But then something significant shifted, didn't it? Modern scholarship came along and, well, threw a wrench in the works, so to speak. What happened in the 19th century with the rise of critical philology?
For centuries, like you said, the texts attributed to Theano and other Pythagorean women were largely accepted without much question. But with the dramatic rise of modern critical philology in the 19th century, everything changed. Scholars began to subject these ancient texts to incredibly rigorous linguistic, stylistic, historical analysis, much more than had ever really been done before.
Okay.
And through this painstaking work, they quickly concluded that these texts were, beyond much doubt, later forgeries. This initial phase of modern scholarship was often characterized not just by skepticism, but by outright dismissal.
Dismissal.
Yeah. The texts were deemed inauthentic, and it was frequently assumed, almost as a matter of course, that the pseudonymous authors were, in any case, men who had simply adopted a female persona as kind of point of decorum, or just a literary device.
So the assumption was it must have been a man writing.
Often, yes. So for a long time, Theano and her fellow Pythagorean women were effectively relegated to a mere footnote, seen as curiosities, or worse, deceptions of a later, supposedly decadent period of forgery. They were essentially written out of serious philosophical history for a while.
So she went from accepted philosopher to dismissed forgery, often with this sense of disappointment, maybe. But then something quite transformative happened, didn't it? The advent of second-wave feminism in the latter half of the 20th century seems to have had a profound, almost revolutionary impact on how academia, and particularly historians of philosophy, approach these figures.
It absolutely did.
Yeah.
This began to change significantly with the advent of second-wave feminism and its powerful influence on academia starting in the 1970s and beyond. Feminist historians of philosophy, most notably Mary Ellen Waithe in her groundbreaking multi-volume work, A History of Women Philosophers.
A landmark work.
Absolutely. They initiated what they powerfully called a project of retrieval. Waithe and her colleagues argued, with compelling evidence, that the traditional philosophical canon, the accepted list of great thinkers, was not some neutral, objective compilation. Instead, it was profoundly biased, having systematically excluded, marginalized, or simply overlooked female thinkers throughout history, often for no other reason than their gender.
Right.
They insisted on taking figures like Theano and the traditions surrounding them seriously. They weren't necessarily trying to naively prove the authenticity of every single attributed text. Instead, they shifted the very nature of the inquiry. The question moved beyond a simplistic authentic or not.
To something deeper.
Yeah, to deeper, more nuanced inquiries about the historical conditions that led to their exclusion, the reasons why some voices were amplified and others silenced, and the intrinsic value of even problematic or pseudepigraphical evidence.
This intellectual move was truly pivotal. It essentially said, okay, maybe these aren't her direct words from the 6th century BCE, but the undeniable fact that these texts exist, that later authors felt compelled to create philosophical works under a woman's name and attribute them to a Pythagorean female sage, that tells us something profound and invaluable.
Right.
It speaks volumes about who was thought to be a philosopher, what roles women could conceivably play, and why certain voices were deemed worthy of preservation even if under a false name, while others were simply lost. It really changed the landscape of how we approach philosophical history.
This crucial reevaluation brings us to the most recent and I think maybe the most sophisticated scholarly approach to figures like Theano, one brilliantly exemplified by Dorota M. Dutch in her insightful work, Pythagorean Women Philosophers, Between Belief and Suspicion. Her approach draws heavily on the philosopher Paul Ricoeur's concept of hermeneutics. Can you explain this powerful hermeneutics of suspicion and belief for us? It sounds contradictory, but it's actually incredibly illuminating.
It is, and it's a testament to really nuanced scholarly thinking. This approach proposes a sophisticated methodological framework for approaching these challenging, ambiguous texts. It requires holding two seemingly contradictory attitudes in productive tension, almost like seeing through two different lenses simultaneously.
Okay.
First, there's a hermeneutics of suspicion. This is the critical, scholarly imperative to be inherently suspicious of these texts as transparent, unvarnished historical evidence of a 6th century BCE woman's thoughts. We must acknowledge that they are pseudepigrapha, that they were very likely written by male authors in a much later period, and that they often reflect the patriarchal ideologies, the social constraints, the evolving philosophical concerns of their own time, rather than Theano's.
So be critical, don't take them at face value.
Exactly. For example, we cannot read the letter to Nicostrate as a direct, unmediated historical account from a woman in the 6th century BCE. We must read it with suspicion as a later construction of ideal female behavior, potentially shaped by male authors' perspectives on what a virtuous woman should be. It's about being critically aware of the text's origins, its potential biases, its strategic function.
Okay, so it's about not being naive, recognizing the layers of construction and the potential agendas within the texts. It's like wearing one pair of glasses that helps you spot all the cracks and inconsistencies. What about the hermeneutics of belief side of the coin? How do you reconcile that with suspicion? It sounds like the opposite.
That's the crucial second lens. Second, there's a hermeneutics of belief. This is the interpretive imperative to engage with these texts, hopefully, to believe in their intrinsic value as cultural and philosophical artifacts, and to ask what philosophical work they perform simply by existing.
So not belief in their literal truth, but belief in their significance.
Precisely. Instead of simply asking what the texts transparently represent, the historical Theano, we shift the question to ask, what does the existence of this text network actually do? What function does it serve within the broader intellectual history of Greek culture, regardless of its true authorship?
And Dutch's compelling argument is that it enacts the very role of the female philosopher within Greek culture.
Hmm.
It creates a fictionalized version of Greek intellectual history that makes place for women philosophers.
Exactly.
It gives us a window not into the precise historical woman, but into the very idea of a woman philosopher that was created, sustained, and circulated within ancient thought. It's how we navigate history when the records are messy, isn't it?
Precisely. From this powerful perspective, the true and enduring value of the Theano corpus lies not in its dubious claim to represent the precise thoughts of a historical person from the 6th century BCE. Instead, its value lies in what it is and what it achieves as a literary and philosophical tradition. It is a tradition that actively conceptualizes and legitimizes female knowledge and agency within a philosophical framework. It provides a powerful, tangible model for how women could participate in the philosophical life, not by rejecting their socially defined roles or trying to imitate men, but by transforming those very roles as wives, mothers, household managers into a rich and legitimate site of ethical and intellectual practice.
So this approach lets us move beyond the dead end of trying to prove her historical existence.
Exactly. This approach, for contemporary scholars, allows us to move beyond the frustrating biographical impasse. We can now appreciate the Theano tradition on its own terms, as a fascinating, significant, and highly revealing chapter in the ancient and indeed ongoing conversation about the very gender of knowledge and the inclusivity of philosophical inquiry.
So as we bring this episode of AI History of Western Philosophy to a close, it's clear we haven't found a definitive, verifiable biography of Theano. Not really.
Not clear picture, no.
But through this deep dive, we've arguably found something far more important, something that speaks volumes about the history of ideas itself. The historical Theano, that woman from the 6th century BCE, who may indeed have studied in Pythagoras' incredibly progressive school. She remains largely inaccessible, a phantom, like you said earlier, glimpsed only through the distorting, agenda-driven lens of sources written nearly a millennium after her time. And, as we've seen, insisting on her direct authorship of these later ethical and metaphysical texts is simply unsupported by the rigorous historical and philological evidence.
Yet, and this is crucial to simply dismiss her on these grounds, to just relegate her to a mere footnote or an historical curiosity, would be to miss her true and enduring significance. The figure of Theano, as carefully constructed and perpetuated in the later pseudepigraphical tradition, is of immense and undeniable importance to the history of philosophy, precisely because she is a construct.
That's right. Because the On Piety fragment, while not her own words, demonstrates a surprisingly sophisticated attempt by later Pythagoreans to defend and refine their school's core tenets.
That brilliant reframing of cosmology.
Exactly. Reframing its cosmology in terms of formal rather than crude material principles. And those ethical letters, even if written centuries later, constitute this unique and remarkably coherent philosophical project. The establishment of the domestic sphere as a legitimate, even noble arena for female virtue and profound philosophical practice, all beautifully governed by that quintessential Greek ideal of due measure.
And her persona, the wise wife of the master, the authoritative teacher of women, the very embodiment of harmony and order within the household, it provided a powerful, enduring archetype of the female sage that resonated deeply for centuries. She became a model, a conceptual space, a profound possibility for women in philosophy, demonstrating that intellectual and ethical excellence wasn't confined to the public square, but could be cultivated and applied in all aspects of life.
Ultimately, then, Theano's greatest contribution to the discipline of philosophy may not actually be a specific doctrine or a verifiable biography,
Unlikely.
but rather the essential set of critical questions her enigmatic case forces upon the modern historian. Studying Theano, as we've done today, it's a masterclass in source criticism, isn't it?
It really is.
It's a vital lesson in understanding the often hidden agendas that shape biographical and hagiographical writing in antiquity. And it serves as this stark, powerful reminder of the inherent biases embedded in the very formation of the philosophical canon, the stories we choose to tell and the voices we choose to remember. Her elusive yet persistent presence at the very dawn of Western thought compels us to interrogate the nature of textual transmission, the fascinating function of philosophical branding and pseudepigraphy, and indeed the perennial ongoing struggle to write a more inclusive, more honest, ultimately a more accurate history of ideas.
Theano is not an answer to be definitively found, but rather a problem to be perpetually engaged with. Her story, in all its complexity and contradiction, reminds us of the countless voices that have been silenced, overwritten, or even strategically invented throughout history. And it compels us, as curious learners, to approach the entire history of philosophy with a necessary and deeply productive skepticism. A skepticism that doesn't just dismiss, but rather seeks deeper understanding.
So, for you, our curious listener, the next time you encounter a historical figure, perhaps pause and ask yourself, whose story is this, really? And what does its telling, or indeed its non-telling, reveal about the storyteller and about the historical moment in which that story was either preserved or obscured? Thank you for joining us for this compelling journey into the Theano problem on AI history of Western philosophy.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next time.